So just a fair warning, this video will have spoilers for Death Note. It'll also have spoilers for Death Note sequel. Cause yeah, apparently Death Note has a sequel. I've been a fan of Death Note for about a decade, except for, I'm 29 right now, so it would more be like a decade and a half. I think I was like 13 or something when I first saw it. I was the perfect age to get really into Death Note and just stumble across it really late at night on Adult Swim. I've been a fan all this time. I've read the manga a couple different times. I've watched the show a couple different times. I watched that terrible Netflix live action adaptation, but I did not know that in 2018, I believe, they came out with a sequel. It was in a manga. It's not like a full series or anything, but they do expand upon the lore a little bit more, and as far as I know, it's canon. According to the Death Note wiki, it is, at least. So it takes place about, I think the way they say it is 9 years after L dies and 3 years after Light Yagami dies. People randomly start dying again. Well, I shouldn't say randomly, because really, it's a bunch of old people. Like, I think they're 60 or 65 years or older or something like that. And it's mostly people who are wanting to die, because apparently in Japan there's a bunch of old people who are just ready to kick the bucket, and for whatever reason their bodies just keep on living. Anyway, they start dying, and people start attributing it to Kira. If you don't know, Kira is who controls the Death Note, essentially. It's like the public name for whoever's behind the Death Note. The main Kira has always been Light Yagami, but there has been a couple people to like step in his place to either assist him or different things like that. But again, like I said, Light Yagami's been dead for a few years at this point. The police do know that there's a Death Note, but the public doesn't know exactly how Kira commits the killings. They just know that somebody seems to be killing people again. Even though they're not positive that Kira is doing this, there's a good chunk of the population that kind of believes it, and the police are also pretty certain. Again, they know that the Death Note can kill people due to different diseases and everything like that. Again, if you don't know, the Death Note would typically kill people from a heart attack if all you do is write their name in it. However, if you were to write something like Ash Ketchum gets hit by a bus, then Ash Ketchum's going to go get hit by a bus. So you can kind of control it to an extent. But yeah, these old people keep dying. People are thinking it's Kira. And it gets to the point where there's actually a TV segment on Sakura TV, which in the original series was the main source of communication with Kira. They had a whole lot of, I guess, publicity towards the Kira case, whether that be a good or a bad thing. So in Sakura TV, they have a bunch of people behind these like walls that kind of blur their faces talking about this situation, because of course Kira needs to at least see someone's face and have their name to kill them, because they gotta write the name down in the book, but they also have to have their face in mind. If you don't know, you can like make a deal and get the Shinigami eyes. It's like a way to see someone's name just by looking at their face, which I assume this is what this Kira has been doing, because during this TV segment, people start talking about like, why is it old people that just get to die? I actually came here because I'm tired of life. So that kind of breaks this group of people out into a mob of all these people who are just wanting to end it, essentially, and they topple over the wall that's supposed to be blurring their faces, all begging for Kira to end them, and he obliges, and it starts to kind of go crazy. Now, during all this, Nier, who is L's predecessor, L being the main lead detective who was hunting Kira in the original series. I'm going to assume that you guys have seen the original Death Note or read it or something, but just in case you haven't, I'm trying to fill you in a little bit. So Nier took over L's place and is acting as the new L, and he works for the FBI. The FBI keeps on encouraging him to look into this Kira case. He's also confident that it is a Kira, but he knows it's not the Kira, obviously, because, again, Light's dead. Nier helped cause that. He honestly finds this case incredibly boring. He keeps saying, what would L do? And they're like, well, you are L, so, like, what would you do? But Nier thinks back to the time where he was living in an orphanage, and L basically had a Q&A with all the orphans there, and he mostly just sat there and listened. But one thing that L said really stuck with him, and it was that he doesn't solve cases for any sense of justice or anything like that. He mostly solves cases because it's entertaining to him. He sees it as the same as like a game or a puzzle. Nier, he ends up dubbing this Kira C Kira, the C being cheap. He thinks it's a cheap knockoff of Kira, and thinks that the case is just boring and he doesn't want to take it on. But after all the people at Sakura TV start begging for death and Kira starts to write their names in the notebook and ends up killing them off, Nier decides it's time to make a public statement. He goes on live TV as L and announces that he does believe that this is the work of the same method used for killing as the previous Kira, aka the Death Note, but he, doesn't say that part out loud. But then he also announces that he's not going to look into it because this is the responsibility of the Japanese police, and he finds this Kira boring, and he calls the C Kira nothing but a murderer. And then we cut to the most we see of the C Kira, which we never actually even get a look at his face, but he kind of stops writing names dead in his tracks as he's being watched by a Shinigami who had presumably presented him with the Death Note. They are obsessed with bananas this time, not apples. And it's not Ryuk, by the way. We then cut to the Shinigami realm, and that same Shinigami, which I believe their name is Midora, they are approaching Ryuk asking if they want this Death Note back. And Ryuk's basically like, what, your little game's over already? And she's like, yeah, you made it look like it was going to be really interesting to bring a Death Note down to the human realm, but after a while, their human just sat in a corner for 3 days before writing their own name in the Death Note. So that little comment from Nier, or L, just calling them a straight-up murderer, apparently really got to them. Ryuk tells Midora that his human, Light, told him that the owner of the Death Note needs to be very strong-willed and strong-minded, and she probably just picked a bad human. But anyway, Ryuk decides he wants to be fed apples regularly again, so he's going to go down to the human world and give someone else a Death Note, see what happens. And that's about where the first chapter of this sequel comes to an end, that chapter being called C Kira. We now move on to the chapter called A Kira. Ryuk goes down to the human world, and he ends up finding a middle schooler who is at the top of his class and apparently scores straight A's in all of his tests and quizzes and everything, by the name of Minoru Tanaka. I believe I'm saying that correctly. If I'm not, just let me know in the comments. Please put something in the comments. Like the video, subscribe. I'm just going to throw all that in there right now. Anyway, moving on. He drops the Death Note on Minoru's head. And after the initial shock of a, death god presenting himself to him, which really doesn't shock him as much as what you'd think it should, he takes the Death Note home with Ryuk as the rules are explained to him. Ryuk reveals that this is the same tool that Kira used to kill people, and the kid's amazed and explains that they're taught about Kira in school even. Ryuk's like, oh, so he went down as one of the greats, eh? And then the kid's like, no, they pretty much teach us that he's like super evil and you shouldn't do what he did. But anyway, after he comes to the realization that he holds this power, Ryuk's kind of like urging him to use it a little bit, but Minoru doesn't really want to kill anyone. So he's trying to think of a way to use the Death Note, because if he relinquishes ownership of the Death Note and gives it back to Ryuk for another human to find, he'll forget all of his memories of it. But he doesn't necessarily want that. Not yet, at least. He tells Ryuk to come back in 2 years, and Ryuk's a little bit surprised by this, but he's like, hey, listen, if you want apples regularly, I can provide apples regularly. However, you need to come back in 2 years, and if you don't like that, just go find someone else. Ryuk agrees, because he thinks this kid's going to be a good candidate to be the next Kira, and comes back 2 years later, touches him with the Death Note. The kid had relinquished all of his ownership at that moment until Ryuk were to return, and he gains all of his memories back, and he's happy to see Ryuk. And he's like, okay, now my plan can finally go into effect. And Ryuk's like, okay, well, what's this plan? Minoru explains that he's not going to use the Death Note. He's going to sell it. And Ryuk's a bit surprised by this, but I mean, if you think about it, yeah, like a ton of people would pay a lot of money to have that kind of power. So what he has Ryuk do is go to the Sakura TV station and hold up a sign. Granted, no one can see Ryuk except for Minoru and then the people who have touched the Death Note previously, which in this case would be In or Nier, who looks like he's never had a haircut, by the way, and the Japanese police force, maybe a couple others sprinkled throughout there. But the numbers aren't large, but the people who can see Ryuk are pretty important. Minoru knows this, so he has Ryuk travel underground so he basically can't be traced. Ryuk shows up at Sakura Studios, holds up a piece of paper that says the tool that Kira used to kill is up for sale, and to use a hashtag on Twitter to basically place their bid. This goes viral as hell. And the police see this too, as well as Nier, and it's pretty much on. Within a couple days, Minoru is hearing about a lot of the bids that are going on Twitter. And they start off in like the hundreds of thousands and then the millions. Meanwhile, the police and Nier are both kind of scrambling to kind of figure out who this new owner of the Death Note is. Nier does decide he's going to help the police in this case because this is interesting to him. And, you know, he wants to take on cases that are interesting. Matsuda, a detective from the Japanese police, ends up tracking Ryuk through surveillance cameras to see where he goes after he leaves the studio, but that's when they find out that he's just sinking down into the ground and then traveling that way, so he can't be tracked. Nier, who was working on building a model of Ryuk's head, decides to just scrap that completely because any facial recognition software that he had planned on using for the Shinigami is now just completely void and useless since that's how he's traveling right now. And Minoru is communicating with the public through Ryuk, through Sakura TV, just having him hold up pieces of paper, the papers from Sakura TV, written with a pen from Sakura TV, so it's not like they can trace that or anything. And now the bids have gone from the millions to the billions. And it gets to the point where the bids are more than the richest person on Earth could afford. And at this point, people are either thinking that there's organizations working together to bid on this, and even entire nations become part of the bidding war. And when the nations get involved, he has Ryuk hold up a sign that says, if you're a nation and you're bidding, don't even bother with Twitter, just publicly announce it. So the Chinese government's going on air saying that they'll pay this much money and only use the Death Note, well, they don't know it's a Death Note, and only use the weapon for good. And the United States is getting on there and going, we'll pay this much money and not use it at all. And so he has Ryuk hold up another sign, and it's like, if you're a nation and you're bidding, only say the dollar amount. Don't give me any other nonsense like what you're going to use it for or anything like that, because honestly, who's going to believe you anyway? Meanwhile, while this is going on, Nier and the Japanese police are still very stumped on how they're going to track this Akira down, which is what Nier has dubbed him, Akira. So they're thinking, well, maybe we can find out who this Kira is after the money has been deposited in his account, because obviously after he gets like billions of dollars out of nowhere, we're going to know who he is. However, the problem with that is, as soon as he gives the Death Note to someone else, that Kira is going to completely lose any knowledge that they were Kira and effectively be completely innocent. And they're also thinking, is what he's doing even illegal? Because he's not killing anyone with the Death Note. He's just trying to sell it. People sell weapons all the time. So it's become a big pickle, but they're very interested to see like what this Akira's plan is. By the way, at some point during the midst of all this, a Shinigami by the name of Justin, like he's got a different name, but also his name is just Justin. So anyway, the Shinigami named Justin comes to get Ryuk for a moment and be like, hey, the king of the Shinigamis wants to see you. And Ryuk's like, okay. When he comes back, the United States is announced as the winner of the bid. And by the way, they just straight up have Trump in here. They don't specifically say it. They only call him Mr. President. But I mean, look at this guy. Now, I don't want to get political on my channel at all, but I feel like they treat him pretty accurately. So again, the United States is the winner of the Death Note. And they win the Death Note for the amount of 1,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000 for $1 quadrillion. For $1 quadrillion, the United States wins the bid, which is a bunch of money. So he announces that in order to process the payment, it needs to be placed into every single member of this certain Japanese bank, placed equally into all of their accounts for everyone under the age of 60 or 65, something like that. And there's still like thousands and thousands of members of that bank who are all going to receive equal amounts of this money. So it's still going to be very hard to trace who the actual owner is. And at this point, when Nier finds this out, he's stumped, and he essentially just admits defeat to this Akira, that he did not figure out who he was, and it's going to be too late because by the time that money is deposited and ownership of the Death Note has been relinquished, there's no finding this guy because he won't even remember that he owned the Death Note. He'll just be one of the thousands of people who got really lucky and scored the equal amount ends up being about $10 million per person. So he's rich. A bunch of other people are rich. It's looking pretty good for the people of Japan, minus the riots trying to make an account with that bank after this is announced. After he hands the Death Note to Ryuk to go hand away to the US president, he tells Ryuk to never contact him again under any circumstances, so that way he has nothing to do with the Death Note permanently after that. And of course, Ryuk is a Shinigami of his word. Minoru ends up being one of the only owners of the Death Note who uses it, and pretty much succeeds in beating L without ever writing a single name in it. So then we cut to the United States, specifically the Oval Office, where Ryuk is about to hand the Death Note over to the president. However, Ryuk is explaining that the Shinigami King was pretty upset with him that he is allowing all this to happen and allowing the Death Note to be sold. So now, there's a new rule in the Death Note. If you sell it, you die. And if you buy it, you die. So he basically tells him, hey, you can buy this Death Note. You can't get your money back, but if you take it, you will die. Someone of high power in your country will find it and they'll be the owner of it. So it still will belong to your country. Or you can just not take the Death Note and lose all your money and live. And the president decides, yeah, he's not going to take the Death Note. He's going to say he did and just pretend like he's not using it, and people will think he's a saint. And yeah, that seems pretty in character, I gotta admit. So Ryuk flies away with the Death Note, and after, I think it takes about a month for all the money to be deposited into those bank accounts. And as soon as Minoru goes to go withdraw his money, he falls flat on the floor due to a heart attack. Because again, if you sell the Death Note, you will die. And that's where the story of Akira comes to an end, and that's where this sequel to Death Note comes to an end as well. It was a pretty good little read, I gotta admit. Now, it's not as good as the original story, but if you are really wanting more of this universe, go for it. Buy the Death Note short stories book. And that only really covers about like half of this book, so there's more in here. There's some backstory to L, and there's also a little, I want to say it's a non-canon event where Ryuk gives the Death Note to someone else again, but it's still pretty interesting. So if you guys want me to cover any of that, definitely let me know in the comments. I'm happy to look more into the Death Note lore. It's something that, like I said, I've always really enjoyed, so I'm happy to talk about it. I was pretty thrilled when I saw this just sitting in Walmart for like 12 bucks one day. So I had to pick it up, and I just really wanted to share it with you guys since I made a whole 30-minute long video talking about the original series, which if you haven't watched that, definitely check it out. I also have a Death Note animation that I'm pretty proud of. It's probably my favorite animation on the channel so far, minus the Malcolm and Dave stuff, which if you don't know what that is, go watch Malcolm and Dave. But yeah, check out the Death Note animation. I know I'm asking you guys to do a lot, but I want to ask you one more time to like the video, comment below what your thoughts are, and again, if you want me to cover the other stuff, and feel free to subscribe if you enjoyed this. I guess that's all I have to say right now. How about this? I'll pose a question. You let me know in the comments. If you came across a Death Note, would you use it? How would you use it? Or would you just give up your ownership and forget you ever had it? But yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you all for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and try to make someone else's day just a little bit better. Later.